Alright, so the book that I read and will be reviewing and kind of summarizing for you today was The Genome War, how Craig Venter tried to capture the code of life and save the world. And you see Venter there on the top left, and probably the familiar double helix shape of DNA on the top right. First, I'll just briefly cover the author and how this book was sort of written. James Shreeve is primarily a journalist. He's been published in Discover, National Geographic, Science, a handful of other technical and scientific journals. He's also written a handful of scientifically inclined novels, so this is sort of in his realm of, not as an expertise, but experience, I would say. He began shadowing Craig Venter in May of 1998, just as the story of the genome race was starting to go public. But he was denied access to the Human Genome Project's leaders, which were Venter's competitors. We'll talk more about that. And as it turned out, this uneven access led to some other focuses, more so than he initially anticipated. And one of the quotes that he has in his epilogue is, "It soon became apparent that the competing ambitions within Celera, Craig Venter's company, and even within Venter himself, were just as compelling as the conflict between the company and the government program that was receiving so much media attention." So throughout the whole book, he sort of balances this human approach to management and innovation with the actual fight and the race that was going on externally. So with that, we'll get to the fun stuff, the genome, the race, and Celera. This is a very complex story with lots of technical details and lots of people, so I'm going to gloss over some of them. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them at the end, but it's too much to cover in my probably now only 5 minutes, so just maybe a disclaimer. As far as the history of DNA, Gregor Mendel is sort of the founder of genetics, born in 1822. He crossbred pea plants to investigate heredity, and he found the recessive gene. So some pea plants were green and some were yellow, but sometimes you could get a yellow pea plant from 2 green pea plants. And so that was monumental, but it wasn't discovered until after his death. Fast forwarding a little bit, James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the double helix shape of DNA, as well as the A, T, C, and G letters or base pairs that make up the DNA that we know. Then the Department of Energy, the DOE, suggested mapping the entire human genome in 1986. To give you an idea of the scale, it's roughly 3 billion letters on each strand of the double helix, and at the cost of $1 per pair, you're looking at $3 billion to do something that you don't know could be accomplished or not. There are also some serious ethical implications. Should we really know everything about the human genome? Was that appropriate? So there was some pushback, but officially the public program began on October 1st, 1990. It was under the National Institute of Health, not the Department of Energy. It was directed by Watson, who at this point has the Nobel Prize. He's sort of pushing people, and once he says to go, it's okay to go, everybody sort of follows suit. So Congress gave $200 million annually for the next 15 years, which is quite the paycheck. Watson set 3% aside to explore ethical, legal, and social issues. That number just came to him at the congressional hearing. The money was dispensed by the National Human Genome Research Institute, NHGRI, one of the many acronyms in the book, based on a peer review system. They were going to approach the genome in a map first, sequence later approach. So to get an idea, if you're going to draw a map of a region, the map first, then sequence later would be find the landmarks, find the mountain, the hill, the river, and then go through and match each tree, bush, relative to those landmarks that you created. So the idea was 5 years for the mapping, and then the sequencing could be given and done in an industrial sort of process. There are problems to this. The landmarks that they were discovering were too far apart to be of any use. They also hadn't developed a quick and cheap sequencing method. And then lastly, there's this territorial mentality. Holy cow. So their attitude was that quality first, let it be free. They were kind of slow. They wanted it to be the best it possibly could. This idea of it's for mankind, it has to be perfect. And then they also wanted it to be public, so they weren't going to patent anything. Now, the disruptive innovator, Celera, you can see the kind of funny cartoon here, genetic patents. There's a lot of money to be had. They were funded by PerkinElmer, a drug pharmaceutical company, at $300 million. And they wanted to use the human genome shotgun technique, which sounds pretty violent, and in some sense it is. You blast a small strand of DNA with a pressurized jet of air and shatter it into small pieces, and then you use algorithms to assemble it and to find where it matches up. Now the problem is about 30%, I think 70% of the human genome is actually repetitive and worthless. So there are all these sequences that actually could be more than one place at once. So it's quite a complicated technical process to find that. And it wasn't proven, so the public system didn't think it could work. And when Venter told them he was going to try it, they thought it was ridiculous, and they weren't going to go along with it. They also didn't know how they were going to make money. Venter wanted to make it public, but you can't make your information public if you're an information gathering company. So that was a really big concern when they started. So this kind of sums up when Venter told them they were going to use the whole genome shotgun technique and get done 4 years before the public program. He told Francis Collins, the director of the program, that you can do the mouse genome. And I think that was the start of a lot of the conflict that we'll see throughout the story. So you have NIH, they call themselves the G5, they're the 5 main labs that were working on this. Shows sort of the militancy of this argument that happened by this rift. Celera, Insight was another private company, but Insight was there first and no one paid any attention to Insight. We'll talk a little bit maybe about that later. But they wanted credit and they wanted to make money. So there's sort of this. I have Good of Mankind with a question because secretly I think they wanted the credit as well. Scientists tend to have that kind of ego. So, Craig Venter, the quote is, "Hey kid, where's your MD?" I'll skip over a lot of his history for time's sake, but long story short, he became a doctor in Vietnam without ever stepping foot on college. He just knew he'd be safer in a field hospital, and so he learned what he had to do. His specialty was actually sewing people up that had both legs blown off. That was what he was the best at. So he also wanted to change the world. He felt like he could make a difference, and he called it the Venter Unit. This idea was, if you weren't here, how much longer would it take society to be to where they are today if you weren't here? And so he wanted to beat the Human Genome Program by at least 4 years, because he didn't want it to be just a second sooner, because then the Venter Unit is only a second. He wanted it to be as large as it possibly could. So kind of give you a sense of his ego. In the book, he's described by the author as both an inspirational figure and an opportunistic maniac. We can go back to this quote if you're interested, but he has this sort of dual personality, which is quite fascinating. I make the case on an economic level that he was more of a high-level manager. He didn't come up with the idea to do the whole genome shotgun technique. He didn't do the whole genome shotgun. He was mainly the face of the program, and he was actually probably a negative impact on the program. Gene Myers is the person that actually...
Can I have a question? Instead of like rushing through the time, this is really interesting to me, and I think to many of us. Can we just quit with the time and just go back and read through the whole thing? I mean, not the whole thing, but...
How much you can dock me for going long? I can just...
We'll find it.